Japan has already entered a demographic crisis, and this is not a future warning or a distant projection. It is a situation that has already begun, and its effects are now visible in the data and in the economy. Japan is recording the lowest number of births in its modern history, while at the same time, the share of people in extreme old age has reached its highest level ever. These two trends are happening together, and that combination is what makes the situation fundamentally different from the past. From 2025 onward, Japan moves into a new phase. This is the point where medical care costs begin to rise sharply, long-term care expenses increase alongside them, and pension spending accelerates at the same time. These pressures are not arriving gradually or one by one. They are arriving together, and they are changing how much the economy needs to spend just to keep operating at the same level. That is why Japan's population problem is not simply about having fewer people. It is about a sudden shift in the country's cost structure, where supporting an older society requires significantly more resources than before. For decades, Japan knew population decline was coming and tried to prepare for it. But preparation does not stop costs from materializing, and those costs are no longer theoretical or distant. But Japan is not falling apart. It is entering a period where maintaining the same living standards demands more money, more labor, and more pressure on its economic system. This is the result we see today. A demographic crisis that has already started, and one that is now reshaping the country's economic reality. So the real question is not whether Japan has a population problem. The question is why Japan reached this point in the first place, and why this distant demographic crisis could become a threat to the US economy. To understand that, we first need to understand how Japan's population crisis began. Japan's population challenge began with a long period of low birth rates. This crisis did not begin suddenly. It was built slowly over decades, as changes that once seemed manageable and easy to overlook continued to accumulate. For years, the number of children being born stayed below the level needed to maintain a stable population, and that gap quietly widened year after year. At the same time, Japan's working-age population started to shrink. Fewer young people entered the labor market, while older generations stayed longer in retirement, gradually changing the balance that supports the economy. The critical detail is timing. Population changes do not create immediate economic stress. They take decades to translate into real costs, which is why the early warning signs often feel distant and manageable. Japan was one of the first advanced economies to start this process. Its birth rate began falling earlier than most, and its population aged faster as a result. That early start is why Japan is now facing the financial pressure before many other countries do. This did not happen because of a single policy mistake or a sudden shock. It happened because small demographic shifts were allowed to continue year after year until their economic impact could no longer be delayed. So the situation Japan faces today is not an accident. It is the long-term outcome of demographic trends that began decades ago and slowly reshaped the country from the inside. That leads to the next question. If low birth rates are at the center of this process, why did Japan's birth rate fall so far in the first place? The answer is simpler than many people assume. Japan did not stop wanting children. The shift happened earlier, and it happened in the economy. Over time, fewer people were able to form stable households in the first place, and that change quietly reshaped everything that followed. Marriage rates began to fall, not because family life lost its meaning, but because long-term financial stability became harder to reach for younger generations. Wages showed little real growth for decades, while everyday costs continued to rise, slowly changing what felt possible for many people. As income stagnated and uncertainty increased, marriage was delayed or avoided altogether. For many young adults, committing to a household felt risky when the future looked unstable. When fewer people marry, fewer households are formed. And when fewer households exist, fewer children are born, regardless of personal values or cultural expectations. This is why Japan's population decline cannot be explained by culture or personal preference. It is the outcome of an economic structure that made long-term commitments increasingly difficult to sustain. Over time, this pattern reduced family formation across the country, and this structure eventually began to place growing pressure on Japan's entire economy. As the population aged, the effects moved beyond households and into the core of the economic system. The rapid growth of the elderly population pushed government spending higher. More resources were required for healthcare, long-term care, and income support, all at the same time. At the same moment, the available workforce began to shrink. Fewer workers were supporting a system that required more spending, creating a steady imbalance that policymakers and businesses could not ignore. Companies were forced to adapt. Labor became more expensive and harder to secure, so firms reworked their cost structures and adjusted how they operated. Some businesses shifted their focus toward older consumers. Others invested more in efficiency, automation, or simplified services to cope with limited staffing. These changes did not signal economic collapse. They marked a transition toward a higher-cost economy, where maintaining stability required more money and more careful choices than before. Japan did not stop functioning. It continued to operate, but under a new set of financial pressures shaped by its changing population. But this cost does not stop at Japan's borders. Japan's population crisis is increasingly shaping economic conditions beyond its own economy, including in the United States. As Japan's population ages, government spending continues to rise. More money is directed toward healthcare, long-term care, and income support, leaving less financial room for overseas investment. Japan has long been a major source of global capital. As domestic costs increase, that capital becomes more focused at home, reducing the country's capacity to invest abroad. This shift can influence financial conditions in the United States, where global capital flows help support stability and borrowing costs. At the same time, Japanese companies are facing higher operating costs. Labor shortages and rising expenses increase production costs across key industries that supply American businesses. When Japanese firms raise prices to manage these costs, American companies feel it through higher procurement expenses. Those costs often move through supply chains and eventually reach U.S. consumers as price pressure. Japan's population crisis also affects how economic responsibilities are shared. As Japan's policy and fiscal flexibility narrows, its ability to absorb economic strain alongside its partners weakens. That means a greater share of adjustment and financial responsibility can shift toward the United States. Not suddenly, but gradually, as structural pressures continue to build. This is why Japan's population crisis matters to the U.S. economy. It changes capital flows, raises costs across supply chains, and alters how economic burdens are distributed. But Japan is not an exceptional case. What is happening there follows a broader pattern that is already visible across many advanced economies. Birth rates have been falling in multiple countries for years. At the same time, populations are aging, and the share of older citizens continues to rise. In many places, these changes are still discussed as future challenges. The costs feel distant, and the pressure seems manageable, at least for now. Japan stands out for one reason. It started this process earlier than most, and as a result, it is experiencing the financial impact more clearly and more fully. The demographic structure Japan faces today is not unique. What is unique is the timing, not the direction. Other advanced economies are moving along a similar path, just at different speeds. Some are only beginning to feel the strain, while others are still debating when it might arrive. Japan shows what happens when these long-term demographic shifts move from data to daily economic reality. It reveals how costs accumulate, how budgets adjust, and how economic choices become more constrained over time. Seen this way, Japan is not a warning of collapse. It is an early case of how advanced economies absorb demographic costs once they can no longer be delayed. That is why Japan matters beyond its borders. It shows how demographic pressure turns into real economic cost. And that is ultimately about the future cost structure facing the U.S. economy. This is why Japan's population crisis is not a distant story for Americans or a problem happening somewhere else. It is already part of the economic environment the United States operates in today. Through prices, through corporate costs, and through the broader financial system, the connection is already in place and slowly strengthening. When production costs rise across global supply chains, American businesses feel it. Those higher costs show up in sourcing, manufacturing, and logistics decisions that companies make every day. When businesses face higher costs for longer periods of time, prices adjust. And when prices adjust, consumers begin to notice the pressure in their daily spending. At the same time, shifts in global capital flows affect financial conditions. They influence borrowing costs, investment decisions, and the amount of flexibility policymakers have when responding to economic stress. These changes do not arrive all at once, and they are rarely dramatic in the beginning. They move gradually, often quietly, until they become part of everyday economic reality. This is why Japan's demographic crisis matters now, not later. It is not a warning about some distant future or a theoretical risk. It is a reminder that structural costs travel across borders and settle into the economy over time. What begins as a demographic shift eventually becomes a financial constraint. Japan didn't arrive here suddenly, and neither will the United States.